Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to GW Law School. My name is Karen Thornton. I'm the program director of the Government Contracts program here at GW, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this program. We're kicking off the school year with a very lively debate, conversation about a field that has so many interdisciplinary connections, and I think that there are going to be a lot of takeaways for everyone here. And I'm going to turn over the podium to my colleague, Chris Yukins, who will introduce our esteemed panelists. We're very, very delighted to have them joining us this morning, and enjoy the program. Thank you for being here.
Thanks a lot, Karen. Thank you all for being here. I'm Chris Yukins from the Government Procurement Law Program here at GW. As many of you know, the Procurement Law Program has been here since 1960. It's the only government procurement law program in North America. We do a lot of work internationally with other programs, and we really try to stay on top of what's going on in terms of anti-corruption and new approaches to anti-corruption. It's an important part of our curriculum here because corruption is such an important issue in procurement in general. We're very honored to have this morning several distinguished speakers, and we're getting out a nameplate for Karen. Yes. Our first speaker and our sort of keynote speaker is Mihaly Fazekas. Have I got that correct?
Okay.
Yeah? Good
Thank you.
No.
Close enough.
My Hungarian is awful, and I apologize for that. He completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge in 2014, pioneering novel big data methods to measure and understand high-level corruption, state capture, and state capacity in Central and Eastern Europe. He works at the University of Cambridge as the scientific coordinator for the Horizon 2020 funded project DigiWist, a large-scale research project which uses big data to measure corruption risk, administrative capacity, and transparency in public procurement in 32 European countries. He serves as a co-principal investigator on the British Academy DFID-funded research project looking at anti-corruption and development aid-funded procurement. He directs a think tank, the Government Transparency Institute, specializing in using big data to understand government performance. He has experience in both quantitative and qualitative methods in diverse fields such as economics, public policy, and political science, acquired in numerous research projects. And he's worked for the European Commission, OECD, World Bank, RAND Europe, the École Nationale d'Administration, the Hertie School of Governments, and the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And he's going to be talking about taking a large-scale empirical approach to corruption in a market that we're very familiar with, the procurement market here in the United States, with data spanning approximately 10 years. And so you're going to hear a back and forth here between his data-driven analysis and more practical experience that we have from other members of the panel and other members of the room to talk about how corruption actually works in our procurement, in our $500 billion procurement system. We also have Zoe Reiter. Since 2008, Zoe's worked at Transparency International. She's there at the end of the table. She wears two hats. She's the acting representative of the United States and the senior project leader on major international anti-corruption initiatives. Her work in the United States involves working with diverse actors working to tackle corruption in the United States. She also works with TI partners and chapters across the globe to ensure strong public accountability in the delivery of critical basic services and infrastructure. This includes, for example, serving as a strategic advisor to the Clean Contracting Initiative, which brings together the widest possible coalition of government, private sector, civil society, and citizens to monitor 17 major public contracts funded by the European Structural and Investment Funds in 11 EU countries. Zoe's from the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Most important fact, I want to say, did you grow up close to Katz's Delicatessen?
Sure did. East Broadway.
Interesting. We're very, very happy to have you here. We work with TI in various places around the world, including TI UK, which has a very strong focus on defense procurements. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. We also have Carey Clutzz, who is the head of the country programs initiatives for the Open Contracting Partnership. For those of you who don't know what open contracting is, it's part of the Open Government Initiative. And for our students and for other members of the procurement community, it's important to understand that open contracting, open government is the way of the future. The idea is that presumptively everything would be open all the time. And the procurement communities here and around the world are slowly shifting to that. The reality is shifting from a focus on individual pieces of information being released through Sunshine Acts or Freedom of Information Acts to the point where everything is transparent all the time. And as you'll see from Mishy's presentation, it's incredibly important because as that data becomes available, different people can take different approaches to this now newly available data. Carey leads the partnership's country engagement, open contracting implementation. She previously served as a Fulbright Clinton Fellow with Sodimi, am I pronouncing that correctly? Sodimi?
Terrible acronym.
Yeah, the national mining company in Cote d'Ivoire, where she also supported the development of Cote d'Ivoire's first open government partnership national action plan. Prior to her fellowship, Carey is with the World Bank's Governance Global Practice, where she focused on open contracting as well as governance of the extractive industries. Before joining the World Bank, Carey served as executive director of the Bridges of Understanding Foundation, dedicated to fostering understanding between the United States and the Arab world. She holds an MA in Middle East and Islamic Studies from the American University of Paris and a BA in French and Anthropology from the University of Virginia. And you're fluent in French too, right, Carey? Mm-hmm. Okay. With our students, we're always emphasizing that. What are your languages?
C'est très important.
Excellent. Perfect. Merci beaucoup. Scott Amey is last but not least, Scott Amey is here. He joins our procurement reform class every year. He is a very important voice in the way that procurement reform is affected here in Washington, largely through the Defense Authorization Act every year. The Defense Authorization Act was signed by President Trump on, I think, July 13th, is that right? July 13th or 16th? The Defense Authorization Act is the vehicle annually for reform in the procurement community, and Scott is really, he's not the lone, but close to the lone voice for civil society in that process every year. And that's why it's so important that we have him come talk to our students every year. He's a very important person shaping the way that reform is done here in procurement in Washington. He's POGO's general counsel, and he directs his contract oversight and ethics investigations. He testifies before Congress and federal agency panels, submits public comments on proposed regulations, educates the public by working with the media, authors articles and reports on contracting and ethics issues. He received a JD, magna cum laude, from the University of Baltimore School of Law in 2001 and a BA from the University of Pittsburgh in 1993. He clerked for the Honorable James Kenney III in the Court of Special Appeals of Maryland from 2001 and 2003, and we're very, very honored to have him here because of the tremendous work he's done in our community. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Mihaly.
Great, thank you very much. So I have something like half an hour. I'm very honored to be here, really a great fan of your work, and always, a bit, on one hand scared, on the other hand very happy to talk to lawyers who know a lot more procurement than me. I'm coming from the data side, so I hope we will meet somewhere in the middle. What I'm going to cover is very briefly a bit of overview of my broader work. And then most of the time will be spent on the US federal government and company political donations. So as Chris mentioned, I've been coordinating DigiWist project funded by the EU, as well as another project funded by DFID, so that's the UK Development Agency. And as a result, we have gathered enormous amount of data, way more than I can ever analyze. So this is all public data, all replicable, everything is on the web. So very happy to share and work together. So the first big piece is 32 European countries. It's about over 17 million contracts in a single structure, so like that's an OCDS structure, but in addition to this basic descriptive, we also have indicators such as corruption, risk indicators such as transparency indicators, and administrative quality indicators. Then again, in very similar structure, we have data on World Bank funded procurement that covers the whole world, and Inter-American Development Bank and EuropeAid. And we already published one developing country national data set. This is all available on these links. And now this is where my new data collection work lies. Continuing on our development aid work, we're expanding into a couple of developing countries such as Brazil, Colombia, India, Indonesia. You can read these countries. So the idea is that there is a lot of data out there. It's typically in a very crappy quality, typically hard to use, hard to analyze. So put it together using the single methodology for data collection, cleaning, indicator building, and then republishing the data, right? So this is really, in a way, public service, right? We don't do anything with the data other than gathering it, removing some utterly obvious errors, such as €1 billion contract for chairs in a Romanian village, or companies non-existent, but still, marked as winner companies. So basically, this is out there. You can download the data on these websites. As I said, it's open contracting data standard structure plus quite a bit of performance indicators. And finally, the US federal data, federal contracting data, which I will talk about a lot more in detail later on. So when we talk about corruption, there is always a question of definition, right? And then I already have to say, outset that I'm not using a criminal law definition, right? That would be way too narrow for my purposes. I'm using a definition which is actually coming from the World Bank Fraud and Corruption Handbook, but it's also a definition which comes from, which very much in line with political science understandings of corruption or particularism, and very much in line with what ordinary people understand as corruption. So quite some of it might not pass a criminal court's bar of evidence, but still would be understood by ordinary people that this is something fishy, this is something corrupt. So there are two conditions in my definition, both of which requires to be fulfilled to talk about corruption. The first one is avoiding competition where you would expect competition, right? So the default is there's open and fair competition, and then this is limited in one way or another. It can be through procedure types such as a sole sourcing procedure. It can be through very restrictive tendering terms or criteria for eligibility. Endless ways of doing this, but avoiding competition is necessary but not sufficient. To talk about corruption, we need the second condition, which is using these limited competition, restricted competition for favoring a set of connected persons or a bidder or a company, right? So it's not enough that I'm, a school, very good in teaching, but very bad in running tenders, and then I always end up having one company. That has to be some sort of a personal connection, that has to be some sort of favoritism, right? It has to be a cousin or a classmate or something benefiting from this limited competition, okay? Two conditions, very much in line with what ordinary people understand with corruption in procurement, and very much in line with the World Bank and other international organizations understand under corruption. And this is good because these two things can be measured. Competition can be measured and who is winning can be measured. So it directly leads into something measurable, right? So it's not some kind of high-level definition and some sort of perceptions, but really a definition which is tailored to the context, tailored to measurement. So how do we go about measuring this? And then I will have four components here, coming from the logic of how a corrupt group thinks. A corrupt group would target the contract. They would try to overprice it or compromise on quality or compromise on quantity, right? So that's always the goal. That's always the source of corrupt trends. Then because it's a very formalized environment, you always have two contracting parties here. You would have the supplier and the contracting body, or a buyer. So that's the formal observed part of the relationship. And because it's corruption, as I mentioned, there's always a personal connection. And I want to emphasize this, right? Because we always think that these corrupt deals work automatically. But actually, enforcing corrupt deals is very hard. Especially if I give you a big campaign contribution, in return you get me a contract, and then I would have to pass back some of that money through a consultancy contract to a Panamanian firm, right? That's a complex deal. And some of it is enforceable by courts, but other parts of it is just me looking in the eye and then us trusting each other. So that's why personal connections, going to the same school, mutual guilt, sometimes organized crime. We have research in Italy, in procurement, organized crime. These informal enforcement mechanisms are super important. Now, this is very simple. It's not even theory. It's just a conceptual framework with 4 components. But what's nice is that you can have a set of indicators, corruption risk indicators, tailored to each of these. You can look at biases in the contracting process, the tendering process. This could be tendering risk indicators, such as sole sourcing when it's unjustified. You can look at the risks of the supplier itself, so a company registered in tax haven. And I would use this example to highlight that it's not measuring corruption, it's measuring risk of corruption, right? There's nothing wrong with setting up a company in Panama, right? It's not illegal, right? But we all know that often Powerful people set up companies in Panama to hide things, right? So when you observe a company winning a big contract which is set up in Panama, then it's a red flag. It's cause for concern, but it's not proof of anything. Now, you can also have the third group, which is contracting body risk indicators, such as politicization of the contracting function in the buyer itself and frequent change of leadership, politically driven change in the leadership of the agency. And finally, fourth, very straightforward, you can have a direct indication of connections, such as family ties, right? The mayor running a municipality, a wife owning a construction company, and the construction company winning contracts, right? So that's nice, and it's nice because I don't believe that any single indicator on its own is a good enough indication of corruption risk. Why this makes sense is that it can be used for triangulating things, right? I have data coming from company registry information, I can have data from the tendering details, right? And together they can be used for triangulation and increasing our trust that we are measuring corruption rather than something else, right? Because if you look at big procurement data sets, it's very easy to mix up incompetence with corruption or true genuine urgency with corruption, right? So we do need a set of indicators put together to get to something which is more or less valid and reliable in a scientific sense. Now, just to give you one example how this works, okay? One of the stories I frequently hear and read in the media, I'm sure you have heard it, is that, okay, I'm a buyer, say, municipality. I have a few friends. They happen to have a construction company, but they're not really productive. So somehow I have to make sure that they don't really need to compete, right? How do I do that, right? How do I get done a non-competitive procedure where openly, formally have to run a competitive procedure because it's a high-value contract? Well, one way of doing it is that I tell my friends well in advance of an official call for tenders that there will be this tender, get these stamps, these certificates, get started on the drafting your bid, right? For everyone else, I announce the call for tenders Friday afternoon and the deadline is Monday morning, right? And I need a bunch of stamps from the local chamber of commerce and what have you, and this is pretty much impossible. So what happens? Formally open procedure, just due to the very tight advertisement, very short advertisement period, very tight deadline, you have basically no chance if you are someone without the connections, right? So that's the story. That's very straightforward. How do you get to the data from the story? First thing, you plot the number of days for this advertisement period. That's an example from Portugal, 2009-14. What you see here is you have this long tail to the left. So those contracts which are awarded with very short deadline, 1 week, 7 days, 14, 21 days, right? You see the big spikes. These are the legally mandated minimum thresholds by EU regulations, right? So this is the area of suspicion, right? But we have a complex story to try to bring together multiple indicators to get something more reliable. We turn to statistical modeling, controlling for all sorts of factors, economic explanations, and you identify that domain of this distribution which predicts single bidding on a competitive market, right? So that's the story. There is a competitive market, an open procedure, but only one company bids because the deadline is very tight. So in Portugal, the result is that if the deadline, the advertisement period is shorter than 30 days, the likelihood of single bidding increases by 14%. The national average would be something like 18%. So you really have almost a doubling of the risk of single bidding, right? So you have a story, you have a model, and you have two indicators both brought together, triangulated with each other to get to something which is more or less reliable. Risk indicator, again, underlying this idea of risk indicator. Another bit of evidence why you might want to believe me that these risk indicators actually point at corruption rather than something else is crossing objective risk indicators with perceptions. What you have here on the horizontal axis is the control of corruption indicator from the World Governance Institute, which is by and large a bunch of perceptions pulled together. High values means good control of corruption. So that would be Denmark, Sweden, Norway are good governance achievers here. Low values would mean low control of corruption. So that would be the high-risk countries like Italy and Greece and Bulgaria, right? Now, what we have on the vertical axis is a very simple indicator taking all competitive markets in these countries for 2014 and calculating the share of single bidding, right? Very simple indicator is only one part of our theoretical definition. And the nice thing is that there is a moderate fit between these two variables. The correlation coefficient is something like 0.5, right? So what you have, countries perceived to be controlling corruption well, very low single bidding. Countries perceived to be controlling corruption very bad, very high single bidding, right? Not conclusive evidence, but adds to our story. We had a micro story, we have a macro story. Together, they sound very nice. Now, what I like about this regression line is that it also tells you about outliers. So countries below the line have lower objective risk than what we perceive them to be, right? So Czech Republic has a lot lower single bidding share than what its perceived level of corruption would predict. The United States federal government has a lot higher corruption risk in the objective data than our perception would predict it to be, okay? So that's very briefly the method, the data, and the approach, right? Let's look at one concrete application to a very fundamental problem, fundamental question for democracy and how the US federal government and contracting works. So that's a paper together with Romain Ferrari and Johannes Wachs. And it now is available in a working paper. You can download it. So what's the motivation? Why are we here, right? The first thing is that there is a lot of money involved in here, even though I never fully believe OECD's numbers on procurement. Yeah, I'm not the only one, right? Good. Anyways, the conclusion is that there's a lot of money here if you compare it to the total government spending. So that would be the right-hand side. And the US would be, you can help me find it. Yeah, US would be somewhere here, so something like 22% of GDP, according to the OECD. No, 22% of the budget, according to the OECD, is spent on procurement. Okay, it's a lot of money. We don't need to emphasize that.
Procurement is about 3% of our GDP.
Yeah?
It's about the size of Michigan.
Okay. So,
But federal plus 50 states, right?
yeah.
And
So
1,000 municipalities.
yeah. So what I'm much more, motivated by is, this guy. So that's the United States, right? That's the scandal, or now it's a court case, right? Fat Leonard, and he's 60 admirals, right? That's it, right? 60 admirals. I don't know how many admirals there are. Maybe someone can chip in with the numbers. It's huge. It's a huge thing. And then, this walked out from a James Bond movie, right? I mean, this gentleman was paying these gentlemen going to Hawaii, having fun and cocktails. And in return, this gentleman allowed this gentleman to overprice and, get a bit more money out of the contract than what he should get, right? That for them, this became public knowledge now, so there is an investigation. But the story is that this is widespread. This is a huge thing, and this is happening in the U.S. federal contracting system, which is perceived to be well run, perceived to be high integrity and low corruption, right? So there is motivation here. There is a lot of money. There are signs of problems. So let's look at how big these problems are. So how do we get to systematic knowledge about all these? First, let's look at exactly what we want to analyze here. First, the question is about political party contributions of companies leading to a special treatment or a different treatment in federal government contracting, right? So those of you who know party finance rules, companies cannot donate directly, right? They have to donate through indirect means. There are three hypotheses linking party contributions in the US to federal contracting treatment or biases in the process. The first one is very generic. Just donating gives you access to decision makers, no matter whether they are in opposition or the president's party or which chamber. It's really just an entry ticket. You can call up some people. So just giving some money will give you benefits. The second hypothesis is a bit more specific. It's really what matters is who holds power. So if you donate it to the right guys, having the right office, having the right decision-making power, then you will confer benefits on you. as opposed to donating to the opposition or those who don't hold these power. There are interesting papers on the US, like really donating to those people sitting on the appropriations committee. That's the big thing. It's not even parties, individual people and their decision-making power. So really we can get very specific here. And finally, and this is I think the most interesting thing, that there is an interaction between the quality of the bureaucracy of the federal agency or the federal office and party contributions, right? So the idea is that you get real effect when you donate to the right party, you donate a lot, and that donation can influence contracting in particular federal agencies. Those agencies which are, as a starting point, they were weakly insulated from politics, those agencies which are lower quality in terms of their contracting to start with, right? So you have these both ingredients, a lot of money going into politics, and then a bureaucracy which is not up to the task. Now, how does this thing work? Donating to the political establishment gives you access to policy decision makers, and then you get a favored treatment of the company. So that's the idea of just know whom to call up. You know, they would just give you access. The second hypothesis would be it's really about donating to the president because he controls appointments, and then through appointments, favored company will get a special treatment, right? So that would be within agency politics, influencing your winning chances, influencing how you win, right? The third hypothesis would be that you donate to the party and you get your favorite treatment in the budgeting process, in the policy level, right? So I think that's what we discussed before, that in defense what will happen is that influence doesn't happen in the minute of the contracting process, but it happens before that, when appropriations and policies are designed, when purchases are designed and needs are determined, right? So these are the three hypotheses, the link to our research questions. And let's see how we can test them. So we need two data sets, right? We need data on contracting and we need data on contributions. Both are hard. So this slide is a single slide and not even the most exciting slide, but it's half of the work went into this paper, okay? So that's how hard it is. So on the one hand side, we have contracts and payments data for 2004 and 15 from the federal government. We have basic things here. So that's, you know, publicly available data, number of bidders, payment value, names of the buyers, suppliers, right? So that's a data set starting from something like 10 million rows, right? So it's very hard to work with. It's relatively well documented, so I really want to upload the US federal government. So compared to, you know, the standard average in most European countries, for example, you just upload the data set and there is no description of the columns in the data set. The US federal government at least has a nice big data dictionary so I can understand what's public data, right? So that's very nice, that's good practice, even though you would think it's, you know, it's very, very basic. Okay, so that was the federal contracting data. The second data is on political donations, and this is where I'm a little bit more uncertain, because donations partially are registered and partially they are not. So if donations are hidden behind PACs and super PACs, then you don't really know where the data, where the money comes from, in the same way as when individual donations are recorded. So the idea here was that we know companies' employees, and then we can link company through employees to donation, right? So the link is really company level. You know who is winning. We know what that company's donations through its employees.
The Center for Public Integrity is doing a hard look at the second set of data because there's a real concern that the Federal Election Commission data has a lot of garbage in it. Partly because, for instance, the Senate reports that are submitted on paper. Getting them from paper into the computers is creating garbage.
Yeah. So I think but this data is getting updated, as you say, there's ongoing work. So maybe we will update the paper one more round. But yeah, it's the tip of the iceberg. I think that's how I defend this. This is not perfect data, but at least it's what's there is probably correct. Probably a lot is missing, right? So we see the tip of the iceberg. Now, how do we measure corruption risk in federal contracting. Again, this is following the definition and the logic I outlined before. So we have single bidding, that's directly linking to the definition outline, lack of publication of the call for tender, non-open procedure types such as single sourcing, cost overrun, right? So it's like spending more than what you contracted originally, and then supplier characteristics like tax haven registration.
So this is the big question for us,
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah.
If you have what's in Europe called competitive dialogue, competitive procedure with negotiation, what we call competitive negotiations, which is the vast majority of our federal procurement, does it fall into one of the danger categories? Because it's not an open procedure, it's not an open tender.
What was the name?
So
In the US.
yeah, it's called competitive negotiations. So it's something other than a classic open tender, something other than what we would call sealed bidding.
Meaning they pick like three,
Like pre-selected firms.
that
Sort
they
of.
want to.
Not that bad.
It's called competitive bidding, and then they negotiate with them, yeah. It's like how you buy a car.
Right.
But is there an open bidding at the beginning and then you negotiate with the first round winners, or just pick them as you like?
It begins open. It begins fully open.
Begins fully open. I have to double check, but I think if it begins open, then I classified it as open, right? Because at least the first stage has some sort of open meaning. So really, I mean, non-open procedure is like sole sourcing, this kind of classics, which you have a lot of sole sourcing, right? So it's surprising amount. So yeah. And single bidding is amazingly high. It's about 40%, right? I mean, it's 47 or something, right? Yeah, something like that. And this is Poland, that's Eastern Europe. Denmark has 4% single bidding. Sweden has 5%, right? So if you think about perceptions of corruption in the US, and I know a lot of single bidding is justified, but 40 versus 5% in the best European examples. I mean, that was very just shocking. I didn't believe the data for weeks. Like, it's not possible. But
That's Scott.
I believe it.
I believe it as well, because you guys don't follow the chair when I use these numbers. But this is I think just very, very shocking. So how does this look, right? Like, so if there is no publication in the FedBiz Ops website, then the single bidding likelihood goes up from 30% to 50%. So this is straightforward thing. You see it in pretty much every country I have looked at, and this works quite nicely in the US. Some kind of micro evidence, right? Like two things go together. Then this is a very nice bit of evidence coming from a paper from Sandy Gordon, which is looking at politicizing agency spending authority. And then what it does, it looks at a particular scandal, and that's underlying my second hypothesis. It looked at political appointees in federal agency and how they responded to direction from the White House. So that was under the Bush administration, and there was a scandal in where officials from the White House briefed political appointees across federal government, you have to spend in these battleground states, right? And someone from the press obtained these PowerPoint presentations. That's how the scandal broke out. But still, from a scientific perspective, you can use these to identify the influence, the direct influence of political pressure on appointees in agencies, and then what he did, link that to spending, procurement spending. And that very nicely worked is that spending through single bid contracts went up when these presentations were done in agencies. So what really happened, the appointees reacted to the direct pressure from the White House and kept on spending money through single source contracts. So that's what really happened, and it's very nicely identifiable from a statistical sense because you have a direct treatment. We got the PowerPoint presentations, we know which agencies got the direct pressure, and then the results are there. Single source spending went up as a result of these spending.
Just I actually met one of those Republicans.
Yeah.
And as the process was unfolding, those people are treated as radioactive in this community. Everybody moves away from them as quickly as possible because no one wants to go to prison with them. That's what happens. It's really true. You can watch it in the room. People will move away from it because there's such a high risk of prosecution.
Yeah. Okay, so how donations look like is this. Most companies have no donation at all in our data set. And then there is this flat part, which I zoomed in on, which has more or less a normal distribution. These are log donations. So basically, few contractors donate very little, a couple of $100, and then there is the big players. Hypothesis one, when we look at donating to anyone, just whatever donation. How we try to identify this causally, and I know you're not necessarily quantitative scientists here, but the problem is that there's a lot of noise and a lot of confounding factors, right? Because you might say, oh, this company donates, it wins in a particular way, and there's a correlation, right? But this is not necessarily related to causal relationship, right? Like there might be other characteristics of these companies, maybe donator companies are bigger. Maybe bigger companies are treated differently than small companies. And when I just look at the correlation, I miss this relationship. I don't really identify what I want to identify. So there are ways of doing this. One way of getting around this problem is something we call using fixed effects. So in our model, every single supplier and every single office, which does contracting, federal office, has a fixed effect, which means when we compare different companies and offices, we compare them to their own average. So this effect means if company A increases its donations in year one, we get an effect on contracting characteristics, on corruption risk in contracting the year after that for that particular firm. So we compare every single firm from its own past experience. So not comparing Boeing with some sort of small company here selling chairs. We're comparing every company for itself in the past and every buyer to its past, right? Because again, you might have these particular characteristics of, defense department versus, other departments, right? So we try to compare everyone to its own past performance so that there is this noise is taken out, which is due to these organizations being inherently different. You cannot just compare them right away. Okay, so that's basically the logic here. So that's why we have several thousand fixed effects. But that gives us some trust that this relationship is actually causal rather than just simple correlation. So we have a nice linear relationship, and what's interesting here that small donations, they don't matter. There's no effect size, zero effect size. Donations start to have an effect when we get up to the millions. Something like 100,000 to millions, right? So the idea here is that if you donate nothing or you donate a couple of $100, it's pretty much the same. Donations start to have effect on your risks. The 8 risk factors I listed before once you become big, once you start donating a lot. Now, exactly these effects are very small. So if you have high donation and you compare that to zero donation or no donation at all, the effect size is 0.1. This is a scale between 0 and 1. So something like 10% increase in risks. Okay? So if you donate a lot, then your risks increase by something like 10%. The second hypothesis is looking at donating to the party of the president versus donating to the opposition party. And then what you have here is no effect of donating to the opposition party and the same positive effect to the president's party. Other party there is very, very small, insignificant, very, very small, insignificant, but you have significant effects and something like, again, 10% increase of risks. Okay? I call it small effect, like 10% increase in risk, so 1 additional red flag out of 10 red flags if you donate big time, several millions of dollars. Okay? You might say it's actually big, it's up to your taste. Now, hypothesis 3 is something I like the most because this decomposes this average effect into type of agencies. So here you have low, mean, and high risk federal buyers, right? So that's when we look at all the ingredients of the game. Big money going into politics, low quality bureaucracy, and as a result of these two meeting, you have high risk. And this is where the effect size is a lot higher, and we have no effect when the federal agency has high quality, right? So it's a low corruption risk in the past. Right, so the idea is that even if you donate a lot, if you want to win contracts from a federal agency which had very high integrity in its contracting in the past, that doesn't matter. In this game, we don't care who you are. We care about your performance really meritocratically. Right? However, if you play in a game where kind of high risk contracting is the norm, there your donations have a big effect. This is where you can influence decisions. This is where you get a lot higher risk contracts. Okay, I'm not talk you through, but the visuals basically summarize the table. So conclusions, I do find these effect sizes relatively small, even though they're significant in statistical sense. They are robust to all sorts of alternative specifications, right? So that's where we really try to get a causal relationship as opposed just to a correlation between variables. Again, it's corruption risk measured. There is nothing inherently bad about single source contracts, right? We know it's easier to do corruption than a single source contract, but it doesn't mean that there is corruption, right? And policy consequences are profound, right? There's a lot of public debate about stopping from money to get into politics, which is very hard in the US because of the federal constitutional court and all sorts of other, ideas around democracy. But then there's another way to stop the undue influence of money in politics, which is to block, control the payback mechanism, which is building high-quality bureaucracies, right? If you insulate, and formal insulation is there, right? Insulate the procurement function from political influence, then the payback is harder, right? This logic of, I donated to the president's campaign, he appoints his appointees to the agency who then influence the procurement function. That's cut, right? It's not possible because procurement officials would not yield to political pressure, right? So investing into bureaucracy is a potential way of stopping money influencing, stopping political donations influencing contracting decisions. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm too academic.
Yeah.
The high-risk agency,
Yeah.
how did you identify?
Okay. So it's basically a past corruption risk index, right? So you look at the contract year one, and you look at the past corruption risk in the 12 months before.
But you didn't identify them in the paper. You identified them in the paper, then you get feedback from the field.
Oh, you mean like names of the agencies?
What are the bad agencies?
I don't know them by heart, but I can definitely pull them out. Yeah.
For instance, there's a lot of concern right now that the Millennium Challenge Corporation is becoming a political dumping ground. The Trump administration identifying a specific agency would make the dialogue easier.
Yeah. Okay, I can do that. So the paper I'm presenting tomorrow in Boston is actually looking at the number. So we have federal HR database as well. So we look at the number of appointees compared to the staff level, and then what we get. A lot of these high-risk agencies are the ones which have a lot of appointees, like staffed of appointees, as opposed to these who are largely insulated from political influence. So carrier bureaucrats as opposed to appointees. So that's part of it. But I can pull out the exact names. I just always worried about naming a concrete organization.
Yeah,
you want to know the names as well?
No, I do. I want all the names, but I want to go over the run of show just so people understand there's going to be plenty of time for questions and answers for the audience. I already have 10 I want to ask Mihaly, but I'll ask him later. But what we wanted to do really was, after Mihaly's presentation, we're really honored to have, well, obviously Mihaly, but then also the best and the brightest in both the international open contracting field, represented by Carey Clutzz of the Open Contracting Partnership, as well as Scott Amey, who's really led the most formidable work on tackling corruption in federal contracting under POGO. So what I was hoping Scott and Carey could do would be to respond to Mihaly's paper, both, what did they see were the insights and opportunities that were most compelling for their work, as well as what sort of questions they have for Mihaly. They have about 7 to 10 minutes each. And then we're going to have a sort of round of discussion and response, very short, 5 minutes for Mihaly to respond, so that we can really give you guys time to ask your questions. And just to say, for Transparency International, it's really been important, this event, because I'm here trying to set up a new office for Transparency International in the United States. that looks at what we call the U.S. and the world issues, the degree to which U.S. is both a leader in mitigating corruption risk around the world, but also can be a propagator, as well as supporting the domestic civil society organizations and stakeholders who are really tackling corruption issues and really working for more accountable government. So for us, public procurement at Transparency International, which has been around for 25 years, has been a priority for 25 years. But we've never had the kind of evidence-based database that Mihaly and his partners have been able to generate in Europe. So when Mihaly said he's been working on this paper, I was so excited to bring him here because it really brings us, from very different spaces in the public contracting field together to really figure out how we, as advocates, as policy instigators, can design our efforts more sharply to have stronger outcomes so that public contracting is more accountable to the taxpayers and the citizens it was intended to serve. So maybe we'll start with Scott and then Carey, and then we'll give Mihaly maybe a few minutes to respond, and then hopefully we'll have a good conversation with the audience. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So thank you very much for having me here today. This is obviously a very important topic for the international world and also here in the United States. And this is actually very, very interesting because I don't know if we've had an analysis done like this before. So I was happy to read it and see the slides, and I took a lot of notes, and I probably have more questions for you and probably want to be quiet as soon as I possibly can. I want to thank actually the people that came and melted in the heat and sweated through their jacket or are going to put up with a bad hair day today because today is quite oppressive out even at 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. POGO is a nonprofit independent watchdog organization here in Washington, D.C. We've been around since 1981. And we started as the Project on Military Procurement. And so we were the organization that exposed the outrageous hammers and toilet seats and coffee pots and decided to expand our mission to take a look at the entire federal government. I had been with POGO actually for 5 years and decided that I'd go to law school, actually from a professor here at this university convinced me to go to law school. And so I blame Professor Turley for getting me in this mess. And then I decided to come back to POGO as a general counsel. When I first came back, there was a report that was being worked on. I don't know if it had this title at the time, but I came back in 2003, and this report had been worked on by 3 or 4 different staffers, but it was called The Politics of Contracting. Kevin Phelps is a former student that was here, and he might have even worked on this when he was a legal fellow for us, or just at the tail end when this report came out back in 2004. But 14 years ago, we did this report. And actually, your research, I wish I had it, and I actually wish I had his chart that he put on page 6, because it actually is a better description. I put it into words, but this would have made it hopefully make sense to the public at large, members of Congress, and other scholars. And I wish I had this chart 14 years ago to include in there. But what we did in our Politics of Contracting report is we took a look at these factors. At the time, there were some contracting publications that we were getting our hands on that said, avoid competition like the plague. In a system that is supposed to, the default setting is supposed to be competitive procurements, the contractors knew that they wanted to avoid competition. And I think in a lot of instances, agencies sometimes want to avoid competition because it can slow down the process. It can result in bid protests. And so at that point, it's kind of a bad recipe or a recipe for failure there. We were noticing favored bidders. We were also noticing that contract spending was increasing dramatically. Back in year 2000, there was about $200 billion spent on goods and services. In 2004, I think we were approaching the $230 billion barrier. Quite a few years ago, we went over 500 billion. It kind of slinked down, and now we're ramping back up. So last year in fiscal year 2017, the federal government spent $509 billion on goods and services. And that's where we decided to take a look at the politics of contracting, because we started to realize that contracting wasn't as much about just a bid going out, an advertisement, some bids and offers coming in, and then government going through the process. There were some risks in there and some shortcuts being taken. So we decided to try to put Actually, in your chart, we tried to connect some of these circles by taking a look at the revolving door, campaign contributions and donations, and then lobbying expenditures. We actually spent less time in our report on the campaign and the lobbying expenditures as we did on the revolving door, phenomenon, because we were starting to see a lot of people leaving these government contractors and going to work for the industries that they either gave money to or the contractors that they gave money to are regulated. And so I was actually glad in your piece where you had mentioned, at least in the presentation, that there are other factors out there that did this. There are a lot of groups that donate for tax reform, environmental regulations, cutting other red tape, deregulation, whatever it may be. And so it's hard to always link that to the contracting. So that's where I think your work actually fills in the gap that we realized that was kind of there, but we didn't know actually how to grab it and tackle it. And one of the things that we found in our work is just that the amount of lobbyists was going through the roof. We started to see nearly 300 people leave the top 20 government contractors that left the government and left the Department of Defense, left healthcare, FDA and other agencies, and would go work for the contractors. And so we said, why? And it was influence. I think you used the word access up there, which I had, and also competitive advantage. And one of the things that we found out that was for all the millions of dollars that were being spent, that 8 cents for every $100, so for every 8 cents that was spent on lobbying expenditures and campaign donations actually resulted in $100 worth of contract award spending, like money coming in. And so talk about risk. I mean, 8 cents of every 100 is, if you can go out and lobby, if you can campaign, if you can get that competitive advantage, contractors will say they're seizing opportunities. If they can do that, 8 cents results in 100 back. Well, that's a pretty good return. And so that's where when we started to look through this, and that's where we also started to realize that contractors were becoming a very formidable lobbying shop. There was a lot of influence peddling going on. They were donating machines, and that there was an expectation and there was more money coming in that they wanted to get their hands on. And that's where you have to take a look. This is fiscal year 2017 data. Again, $509 billion in contracts. The top 10% get nearly 30% of that. $147 billion of that goes to the top 10. The top 100, $283 billion, over 56% just goes to the top 100. So we may have 20 or 30,000 different federal government contractors out there, but the large bulk of money is going to those in the top 10 and those in the top 100. And so that started to concern us. And then also you started to see some different scandals that took place. These were in more of the legal or the criminal side of things, but you had the Darlene Druyan scandal. She admits in her plea agreement and her criminal case that it was a parting gift to Boeing. She leaves. She was awarding a $20 billion tanker deal. They also found out in their investigation that she also gave a few other contracts to Boeing. Well, her daughter worked there, her son-in-law worked there, and she got a job there. And she even said this, quote unquote, this was a parting gift to Boeing on my way out the door. We had Duke Cunningham, member of Congress from San Diego. And by the way, the Darlene Druyan scandal, and I have to reference it based on the news of the week, was actually unearthed by Senator McCain, who was actually upset the fact that the Department of Defense wanted to lease tankers rather than buy them. And by leasing them, actually, most of us will lease a car. Why? Because it's cheaper. Well, now when you come to the government, everything gets flipped on its head. Leasing was actually more expensive than buying them. And so Senator McCain and his Senate Armed Services Committee wasn't happy about that process. And so they started doing some digging and all of a sudden started to notice some emails being passed back and forth between Ms. Druyan and also her daughter, negotiating an employment opportunity for her with the company when she was going to decide to leave her government position. You had Duke Cunningham, member of Congress. He ended up having something called a bribe menu. He did. It was actually on an envelope. He would take it when you would take him out to lunch or dinner. I would imagine that the contractors were paying, but he had a bribe menu where he would put it down on the table and say, well, if you give me this much money, here's what I'll try to do for you. And so again, criminal side, but donations, I don't know, are much different than that process. You had Loretta Doan, who was also out there, who came in and was running the General Services Administration. The government's Sears catalog, for all of us old enough to know what the Sears catalog is, but the Sears catalog of buying, the agency that buys everything for other agencies and runs our property, she was, accused of steering contracts and putting some pressure on people to her colleagues and some people she knew. So when you talked about relationships and the political connections and indicators in here, you had mentioned friendships. Then, the Fat Leonard, he was on my list of people to make sure I mentioned, and you actually showed a picture of me, so you one-upped me on him. But Fat Leonard scandal, I think we're up to 30-some prosecutions and guilty pleas of, major senior officials in the Defense Department, both in logistics and that work for the Asian Command, that were taking gifts and different things from Mr. Leonard and making sure that not only were they then making sure he got business, but there are also allegations in there that they were sharing classified and proprietary information with Mr. Leonard about deliveries and other things for logistics to help give him a competitive advantage and put him in the know. More recently, so we talked about some of the past ones, the definers. EPA contract was awarded to a group that called the definers. They also had a PAC that supported the Republican Party, and so there were some major questions, and this contract was canceled within days of it being unearthed, but some major questions about whether the head of the EPA helped steer this contract because this group was favored of the Republican Party and helped them with certain things. And it was a sole source contract, I might add, and it was a sole source contract that was actually because the definers provided a unique service, news clipping services. Hopefully that gets some laughs or some raised eyebrows, because there are probably 100 different companies here in Washington, D.C. that provides news clipping services, so I'm surprised that it was considered a unique service, but that's the justification that the government used in using the definers. And so we do worry about all this. I mean, there are rules and regulations that are on the books to prevent all these things. The FAR starts out right away. FAR safe, subpart 3.1 safeguards. Government business shall be conducted in a manner above reproach, and except as authorized by statute or regulation will be completed impartially and without preferential treatment. We also have the ethics pledges that we have, and we have basic obligations of public service. Employees shall not have a financial interest that conflicts with the performance of their duty, the conscientious performance of their duty. They should put an honest effort in the performance of their duties. They shall not use public office for private gain. They shall act impartially and not give preferential treatment to any private organization or individual. They're all standards that are in the FAR, 1,900 pages of the FAR, they're included in there. And they're also included when people come into government office. And so when you talk about the relationships and different things, I think that's what we were seeing. Back when we put our Politics of Contracting report out, we really focused on the revolving door. When people were either coming or going from the federal government, coming into the federal government, or when they were leaving the federal government, on were they using their position either before they left to prefer a vendor or give a parting gift to someone, or when they were coming in, were they giving preferential treatment to someone, former employer or a client of theirs when they were in the private sector. And so you worry about all these things. It was very hard to quantify. And so learning more about the risks and how this and your research has played out, I think makes us want to try kind of jump back into this. POGO will be releasing a report sometime in the very near future, we're hoping in the next month or two, that actually takes a look at the politics of contracting, but at the Department of Defense. We're actually in the process of creating a revolving door database, and then trying to track contracts and following people when they have left the Department of Defense and where they've gone, and then also trying to quantify it a little bit on, was there any increase or blip in their contracts after this person left the government and went to work for those contractors? And so again, in honoring Senator McCain, he actually helped on passing revolving door legislation. In the old days, the Department of Defense used to actually track people when they left the department and would go work in the private sector, and they stopped doing that. There used to be stories written about the increases in the revolving door. Well, Senator McCain, back in 2000, I want to say it was about 2008, actually passed an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill to actually have the Department of Defense start tracking people when they leave government service and where they go. Certain employees, it wasn't everybody that leaves the Department of Defense, but it was people in procurement positions or in like senior program offices, figuring that they were the higher risk. And there were a whole bunch of IG reports and GAO reports about problems with the revolving door. Long story short, Senator McCain was able to pass that. Only problem is that the government's never made that database public. So POGO is out creating their own to try to replicate that. We know that, this is just public sourcing, and we know we don't have as much access, because we knew that there were 2,400 people over the few years when GAO started looking at these people going through the revolving door, and we only have a few hundred. But it is something to worry about. It does increase risk factors when you're bringing people in. And so I found your research to be quite enlightening. And then there's got to be a way that we not only take a look at the political contributions, but some of these other factors with the revolving door, the lobbying expenditures, to really try to really unearth the amount of access and influence that these people try to gain with the government and with agencies and with members of Congress to help steer contracts their way and seize as many business opportunities as they possibly can.
Thank you, Scott. I know you want to answer, but you got to.
No, it's a great comment. So.
No, that was awesome, and I actually am looking forward to that report when it comes out. I'm Carey Clutzz from Open Contracting Partnership, and as Chris said in the introduction, we sort of look at this issue from a more international angle. So we'll sort of take a step back, and we work with Mihaly on a couple of different projects and love his work, mostly because it takes procurement from a very dry sort of compliance exercise, and nobody in this room thinks that that's the case. But the great thing about Mihaly's work is that it shows how powerful it is and why it's so important. And so one stat that we use a lot in our work around the world is that procurement and contracting is government's #1 corruption risk. And the stat from the OECD, take it or leave it, is that 50% of foreign bribery cases prosecuted under the OECD's Foreign Bribery Convention are related to bribes paid for public contracts. That's a huge amount. But that doesn't often resonate in places like the US or, we have trouble with that in the UK as well as in France, some of the European and Western countries. But the cool thing I think about Mihaly's report is that it shows how important this is. The question of corruption is important even in the US. And their examples, Scott ran down a whole bunch of them. And Mihaly's example of Fat Leonard is sort of a striking one. But I think that the interesting thing is the different levels that this works on. And I'm from North Carolina, which is a little bit further away from Katz's Deli. But one close to home, Duke Energy is a huge power company that is based in North Carolina. And Georg, my colleague who's here, sent me this article yesterday looking at corruption related to political contributions that was related to this particular power company. It's particularly poignant because the story that I'm about to tell happened in my grandparents' backyard. So there was this big coal power plant that was shut down in 2010, I believe. 2012, there are instances of about $300,000 being paid by various Duke employees, Duke Energy, not the university, to a gubernatorial campaign that resulted in Pat McGrory being elected as governor. He happened to have been a former colleague of theirs for some 30 years. And one of the first things he did when he became governor was to revamp the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, including decreasing their budget, among other things. So 2 years later, in 2014, there was this big coal ash spill in Eden, North Carolina, which is right on the border of Virginia and sort of in the middle of the state, middle of nowhere. And it spilled 35 million gallons of sludge with lead and mercury and arsenic and all sorts of stuff into the Dan River, right across the river from my grandparents' property. And so looking into this afterward, it came out that Duke had kept the cleanup part secret from the Department of Natural Resources. And so in the court cases that came after that, Duke was eventually fined $25 million for not keeping to that contract, that part of the contract, what to do once the plant closed down and there are these giant pots of poison. The interesting thing was that was later reduced to $7 million for all of the 14 coal plants across North Carolina. And there are a lot of allegations that it was a sweetheart deal for this company that McCrory worked for 3 decades. The thing that ties us back to Mihaly's is that that's nearly impossible to prove in court that it was due to corruption. And so the really cool thing about Mihaly's report is that it has quantifiable evidence that this actually happens. And so that is really cool. We love, he's done studies related to this in the UK as well, and it showed things like local councils with weak electoral accountability have a 50% higher corruption risk. And he's shown that up to 2.6 billion pounds a year, so like over $3 million at the local council level, are lost to corruption. Another place that we're seeing things like this are in pre-revolution Ukraine, and it might seem strange that I'm bringing up Ukraine, but you'll know why in a minute. And so there, before the revolution in 2014, 1/4 of contracting spending was lost to corruption. And one of the best statistics is that metro benches, like so the things on the side of the street, cost the same as a car. So what do we do about this, right? This is a huge issue. And we at Open Contracting Partnership are looking at how we can excuse me, increase the availability of timely, useful, open data, and also engagement from government as well as other stakeholders to really, thank you, it's amazing, to look into this and to build the capacity of people to use that data and create tools. And Mihaly's Digius project is an awesome example of this, to really look into this and fix the problems. And so we've developed, I can pass it.
You're talking.
Not that
We
important.
multitask.
Yeah, maybe. So we developed something that both Mihaly and Chris mentioned briefly called the Open Contracting Data Standard, which is an open data schema that sort of lays out in best practice terms what should be disclosed throughout the entire contracting process. So that's from planning and award all the way through implementation, and when things like cleanup of a coal power plant should happen. And so we also focus on feedback loops and how that data can be used by the government to then fix issues that come up. And so all of this means that you can identify interesting patterns in where the tenders are going, who is winning the bids, does service quality depend on a particular jurisdiction, and are resources being spent in the priority areas. So one interesting example comes from just over the border in Mexico. There's a new airport that's going to be, I think, the biggest airport in the world, maybe, in Mexico City. That's a huge infrastructure project and related to billionaire Carlos Slim, who was the richest man in the world for a while, a couple years ago. And so in the context of their national digital agenda, they've been disclosing all of the data related to the airport contracts in open contracting data format. And so as a result, there have been a bunch of investigations and also tools developed around that data by civil society and journalists. And it's a project called the Control Tower related to the airport. And one of the cool things that's come out of that, they've identified contracts up to $250,000 that A, lacked clear deliverables in the contracts, and B, to Mihaly's point earlier, were done through sole sources to friends. And so that's been a huge scandal there that we're working with partners on the ground to sort of address. Mihaly also mentioned the Digius project in the EU, and that's a really interesting example of a way that you're able to use the data when it's structured. And one of the cool things about the Open Contracting Data Standard, I was speaking with Chris about this earlier, is that when you have structured, standardized data, a tool that's created in, say, Mexico City to analyze airport contracts can then be reused by France or fill in the blank. And so we're working with the EU to update their procurement reforms to include OCDS, which means that that data will be standardized across all EU states, and then anywhere else that OCDS is being implemented, this data standard, any tools that are developed will be reusable. And that's particularly interesting, and this comes up in Mihaly's report, because standardized data lets you link different data sets. And so one of the things that is bubbling up now is the connections between, in this case, contracting information and lobbying or campaign contribution information. But it also relates to comparing budgets to contracts, who wins the contracts, are they actually implemented? And we're working with partners around the world to look at sort of different variations of those comparisons. And Mihaly's report in particular highlights the importance of having a unique identifier that links these different data sets together whether they're from different agencies or different stages of the procurement process. So that's a really powerful tool that I think he does a really good job of explaining why it's important. So then to go back to Ukraine, so in 2014, the same time that all the coal ash was spewing into the river from my grandparents' property, there was a revolution that was in response to a perceived corrupt government. And as a result of that, one of the things that happened is that they completely rebuilt their procurement system. And at the time, the open contracting data standard had just been developed. They learned about this and decided they were going to build their procurement system around it. And that's important because that means that even though it's only been a couple of years, we have baselines and can already see results. So Ukraine has become a really powerful example for us of how OCDS can help. And it was actually just written up in Wired magazine that sort of digs into some of the details with Elon Musk on the cover. And so some of the studies that have been done recently between the old and the new system show that it saved the government has saved $1.5 billion, and that's about 1.4% of Ukrainian GDP. We were speaking earlier about best value contracts, so that's pretty powerful. Particularly related to this, the business's perception of corruption of the system by business has dropped from 59% in 2016 to 29%, so cut in half. And the number of contractors that are bidding on government contracts, to both Mishi and Scott's points earlier, has skyrocketed. And looking particularly at small businesses, that now accounts for 80% of the contractors that are bidding on public contracts in Ukraine, compared to 24% in the UK. And we all know that that's a big focus of contracting here in the US. At the moment, the target is 23%. So there might be a powerful example from Ukraine. And if it works in Ukraine, it should work in North Carolina or the US more broadly. So interested in exploring those relationships.
Great.
So thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Carey. So I'll give you 5 minutes.
Strictly 5 minutes.
I'm
into it. No, but the comments are so great. I agree with all of them. So, no, a bit more in detail. So, I think there's, and I'm sure some of you will pick this up. So, there's a problem to this measurement approach, which takes competition by default as the benchmark. For any measurement, you need a benchmark. And I think it's a reasonable benchmark, but don't take me wrong. I understand there are reasonable excuses for open and fair competition, right? So, there are cases when you know who is the good supplier. Why would you waste your time on evaluating 100 bidders? Now, the very problem with this argument is very often it's abused, right? So when I have to take a position whether I accept these exceptions to the default of open competition, then I rather say it's more likely that it's some problems behind it than not. Now, I know it's an issue, even though the FAR apparently starts with impartially. So I think that's the default, and that's why it's a risk indicator. And it's more likely the lack of competition and the repeat winning of the same company is more likely to indicate likely corruption than not, but still it's a risk indicator. So that's something I cannot do anything with, but I just want to say that I'm with you. It's not always competition with what we need, although, if Denmark can achieve 4% single bidding, I'm still thinking the US should aim higher than 47%, right? Or lower. Okay, so the second point, Scott, yes, I'm very much with you. So there are 3 ways: donations, lobbying, and revolving door. And I want to write 3 papers on US federal procurement contracting. For your information, lobbying data, I've already had a student collecting the first draft of the data. So yes, I think there are 3 papers to be written here. Very, very much so. Lack of electoral accountability. So I want to say, so now we have a paper on Swedish electoral accountability and procurement corruption risks. And then it very much repeats the finding of the UK paper. And why is it important? Why am I raising it? Because before we started this work, there was a paper on Italy and Romania where you would expect, okay, there is no political competition, you find corruption. No one is surprised. But we found similar, magnitude is smaller, but similar mechanisms in the UK and now in Sweden. I'm beginning to think that these problems are everywhere. And I wouldn't be surprised if this happens in the US local level as well, right? Because if politicians are unaccountable because there's no chance of them losing their seats, even in the best designed democratic systems, there are problems popping up here and there. As I said, Sweden and the United Kingdom. So I think that's a side topic, but I want to emphasize this is super important. And then closer to the OCDS, open contracting partnerships, I think this is the right place to talk about these things because lawyers, procurement lawyers, government contracting lawyers know a lot about all the nitty-gritty details. Average people don't, right? For them, it's technically, legally, it's hopeless, right? I mean, I used to say that, my grandma would never open a procurement tender, right? But at one point, this is what we want, right? That the ordinary people get engaged and not get engaged with the different paragraphs of the FAR, right? I don't have, illusions there, but get engaged with the facts which matter for them, right? It's their local school, it's their local bridge, right? And I very much with you to move this field from something very technical, very legalistic and complex, even at the expense of getting lost of some details just throwing away, right? Even at this cost, bringing it closer to people that they start engaging with. I think the spectacular statistics is that in a Slovakian survey, 11% of the population claimed to having checked the procurement contract at one point in their lifetime. I mean, 11%. I mean, isn't it like every 10th person looked at procurement contracts, right? So I think there is a room here to preserve all the detail and the very important work of law, and also with some accepting some details being lost, bringing it closer to people. And I think that's the fancy dashboards, the open data. I think that's a useful addition to what we used to have in the last decades. And I hope that we are moving in that direction to bring it closer to people, because in the end, these are just projects which matter for people, right? And then complexity is a problem because it stops people from engaging, and we need that engagement, right? I think that's my 5 minutes.
That's terrific, and thank you. So I want to open it up to questions. I know I have my own, but I get to corner these people after. And we'll probably do a hard stop around 10:40, and then we'll be around for the croissants and coffee. So questions, please, Professor Skinner.
With apologies that I'm going to exert a little bit of hosting institution prerogative, let me offer a number of things with an eye towards making the paper as powerful as possible. And of course, you can follow up directly on any of them, and I apologize for the longer list. First, thank you for the research. Thank you for presenting it here. There's not enough empirical research on this kind of stuff in the United States, and it's important. But for the students and anyone listening on the live stream, you can read more of Mihaly's work on SSRN through JEL code H57. And remember, we're part of a much larger project of stuff that's being done around the world. So we're often clueless about what's going on outside the world. I'm glad that it's part of the community now. Second, I really appreciate the fact that in the paper, you talk about the fact that where lower institutional quality is seen, the risk is greater. And one of the primary recommendations is strengthening bureaucratic quality. In this community, we consider it a critical theme to talk about human capital, capacity, and professionalization. So, really important stuff. Similarly, we appreciate the nuance that corruption risk is not corruption. And along those lines, I actually like the definition of corruption in the paper that you use better than what you said this morning. And I encourage you to be careful, because this morning you suggested that corruption is about leading towards overpricing or reducing quality, but it's just as corrupt if I go out of my way to maintain my market share or grow my market share, even using the highest qualities for the right prices. So again, the definition in the paper, much better in that regard. On page 10, you make a wonderful point about using debarment as a predictor. But I want to caution you there in the United States, and there's a 2004 paper that we have on SSRN, and Danielle was part of that. But my paper in that is about the paper tiger. And unfortunately, the experience in the United States is we have too big to debar. So small and unimportant firms get debarred, and the big important firms do not. So you have to be a little careful with over-relying on that data. I think it's a concern. A similar tweak in this is there's a lot of data, and maybe this is just a footnote for you, but all of your data, because it's usaspending.gov, is driven by prime contractors. One of the common phenomenon today is subcontractors or fronts, particularly with small businesses or disadvantaged businesses fronting for big companies. And I think that leads to the other thing, which all of your data, because it's what you have, is based on Dunn's numbers. And as you know, around the world, we have this growing concern with beneficial ownership. So I think if you can bring those things together, it's a qualifier. And again, you're working with the best data you have, which is very important. I have another small data point for you on this issue of single source. Scott will appreciate this, but there's a wonderful GAO report out, and I just wrote it up in something called the Nash and Sabinek report. It literally just hit the airwaves yesterday. In the Defense Department, despite the fact that we have a statutory and regulatory preference for multiple awards when we do what we call IDIQ, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, the Defense Department awards over 85% of their IDIQs to a single source. So that's overcoming the statutory mandate for multiple awards. It's still 85%, which is remarkable. A couple more quick things. I wonder if you could, with a little bit of work on anecdotes or controls, try to reduce some of the skewing. So, for example, one of the most compelling anecdotes for many, like Scott and Pogo, would be that in the Bush administration, the log cap contract exploded and became the largest contract in history, and there were a lot of concerns how that was received. But if I just look at the biggest contracts, the multi-billion-dollar contracts, Boeing and the tanker lease, the Joint Strike Fighter, the upcoming Jedi Cloud contract, these are probably less susceptible to political influence, and you could juxtapose the Jedi contract, which people are concerned is being skewed to Amazon, which the president hates, right? So again, but what I think what happens is the really big number of contracts skew a little bit, and the ones that concern me the most are the closed industries. We only have 2 nuclear sub firms left, one's in Connecticut and one's in Virginia, and Congress allocates the contracts between them. There's only a single contractor left in the United States that can make an aircraft carrier. It's a multi-billion-dollar contract. There's no market anymore. So I think you want to pull those out. Yeah. Finally, as we were talking briefly before, there's this issue about discretion. And historically, the world has juxtaposed the U.S. procurement system against the rest of the world because we are more willing to do cost technical trade-off rather than the public bid opening and low price wins. In the bigger contracts, while there's more discretion, there's also more bureaucracy. We have source selection officials, source selection evaluation boards. So I think that it's a slightly different story there on the bigger procurements, and you might get a little bit of mileage out of it. The last thing I wanted to say where I think Scott can help you, the thing that I think you haven't captured which strengthens your argument is the biggest hole is the growth of contracts after they're awarded. And I think about all the press in the last few weeks on the Webb telescope, which has increased 100% since it was awarded. The Joint Strike Fighter, massive cost growth. And I think that in those cases, political contributions after award are also of tremendous importance. Again, thank you for your research. I look forward to seeing more of it.
Great, thank you.
So we can just go do it around, but I definitely want to give, Professor Skinner has to leave at 10:45.
Sure.
So we'll take Professor Yukins, then maybe have you answer, and then we'll do another round.
So picking up on Steve's point regarding the discretion, start with that. That's what he's referring to as the use of competitive negotiations, competitive dialogue. And the World Bank just shifted in the 2016 procurement framework. The first time the World Bank is allowing developing nations, borrower nations, to use competitive dialogue. That's the European word, competitive dialogue.
Yeah.
And the difference from an economist perspective is with a open tender or a sealed bid, it is the agency that's defining the requirements, and then people are coming with low price. With competitive dialogue, as Steve said, you get to have the trade-off between quality and price. And we believe that from an economist perspective, you would prefer that because it means that then the buying agency is informed as it goes through the purchasing process. So that's why we're really trying to emphasize for you that competitive dialogue, not necessarily the work of the devil. We think it's a good idea. On what was very interesting hearing you guys talk among yourselves is that essentially what you're asking for, what you're getting from the advocacy community is a request that you focus on certain initiatives and certain points. And Steve said listen to anecdotes, importantly, because they may help focus your research. So, for example, in our system here in the United States, a small or mid-sized contractor will not think that they can give enough money to Congress to be able to shape the requirements. It's just too hard in the appropriation process. They will give a smaller amount of money in order to establish relationships with a local member of Congress, so when something goes wrong down the road, that congressman, as you said, answers the phone, and then we'll set up a meeting between the procuring agency and the contractor. And they basically, the congressman serves as a mediator. You have to give $100,000 to $200,000 to get that meeting, and you're basically buying an insurance policy by giving $100,000. But that becomes noise, okay? Statistically, what's really important is the large donations, which shape those large requirements. And I would suggest focusing your research and energy at that large, because that's really where politics contributions come at the very early planning stage, when people are deciding, for example, whether or not to build what type of aircraft carrier they want to build. Catherine referred to framework agreements, also very important. Steve just alluded to. I didn't know about this statistic. The 85% going that when framework agreements are awarded, that 85% are being of the actual orders or underlying orders are being awarded on a sole source basis. Very important. Going back to your example of Fat Leonard, the way that the Sixth Fleet and the Naval Supply Command dealt with the Fat Leonard problem is by creating multiple award framework agreements for husbanding contracts in the Far East. Those multiple award contracts are awarded on a transparent basis. The actual orders underneath those multiple award contracts are not transparent. So advocacy community feeding into you saying, okay, what impact is the non-transparency of the actual orders? What impact does that have on what you consider corruption? And it doesn't make any sense why there's not more transparency, because then we have some spurts of information like Steve alluded to. The last thing is the poor contractors being debarred. What Carey was referring to is the fact that we really need to have uniform data sets across different jurisdictions, whether or not state, federal, or U.S., Hungarian, because when we have contractors emerging with performance problems and with corruption problems, if they're debarred in one jurisdiction, other jurisdictions should be able to pick up that information relatively easily. So that would be a very interesting point of research for you, Mihaly, to say, okay, what contractors are being debarred in jurisdiction X and yet are continuing to be fat-telling happening in some other jurisdiction? And that's a huge problem right now. We can't get automatic cross-debarment. People talk about it in the legal community. It's not going to happen for very complicated reasons. But we can get data transfer, and that data transfer is incredibly important. If you, as a researcher, could say, whoa, look, this is crazy. You have company X in this country clearly performing poorly or clearly engaged in corruption. Why is it these other countries are continuing to retain that contract? That would add to the policy dialogue a lot. And that's the whole focus of my argument here is you really want to be talking laterally. You want to get ideas for data analysis from the advocacy community. If you can drive the advocacy in a really important way, we can tell you what channels are likely to be followed in the coming years. It's very predictable.
Do you want to respond or should...
Just a very small thing. So yes, exactly. So this is the distribution of donations, right? So most of them donate nothing. This is log scale. Some donate very few $100, right? A few $100, and then the big thing is here, right? So when I look at these compare small to non, medium, and high donations, so I get effect from the high donations, and that start from $750,000 and above, right? So this is exactly your story. So the big effect is when you give big money. It's positive, even though statistically not significant, so that's noisy. So maybe there is something with the smaller donations, a couple of thousand or tens of thousands of dollars, but I cannot really show it. I think your argument exactly is fitting the data, right? So these are the guys who can probably influence policy design. They also can, people pick up the phone when they call, and they also have other ways of influencing. Because I guess that the list of companies donating big time would be very close to the list of companies hiring federal employees and also spending big time on lobbying. So I think also this big effect is a proxy for engagement in government on multiple channels.
American phrase, go big or go home.
Well,
Yeah.
and people in this room or that are watching on the web, they may ask, well, how can they give that much money? But I mean, these are you mentioned it's segregable funds, and so that was the PAC contribution. So Boeing has Boeing PAC, and Lockheed has Lockheed PAC, or whatever, America First PAC, or whatever they're called. But the other way that they do this is they're pooling all of their donations because you're allowed to list employer. And so you can go on Open Secrets right now and you can actually do a search for Lockheed and you can see every Lockheed employee and their spouse that contributed under Lockheed's name. And so that's how you're pulling all this together. I just printed out this morning from opensecrets.org, Lockheed for the 2018 election cycle has given $3.5 million in contributions and they've spent $21 million in lobbying. So it's $24.5 million just in the last 2 years, and since the 2016 election for this election cycle, to influence members of Congress. Now, are they influencing them actually at the procurement level and at the award stage? I don't think so. That was one of the skepticisms I had when I started reading this. But I think Professor Schooner, his point is, yes, a lot of these are coming after award, especially when now. What is the trend with some of these contracts? It's longer term contracts. It's one base year with 9 option years. Sometimes we've seen some of these contracts stretched out 15, 20 years when you kind of have the monopoly over the contract, but you want to keep it. At that point, I don't think it goes away. I think we're seeing the trend that people are continuing to contribute money. So the options are taken up and there's pressure from your congressional offices, letters get submitted. And so there may be some other non-scientific ways to also skin this cat to see how many times people in the district have asked for letters to be written to support Lockheed or, in defense of Lockheed or something or whatever it may be, any contractor acts that they're doing. And so Lockheed's not even the worst. Boeing is up to $3.1 million, $24 million spent on lobbying. So $27 million that Boeing spent on influencing members of Congress in this election cycle. And so it's to be taken, right, in a midterm, in a midterm election. So it does throw out your presidential party a little bit, but who knows with this president, we'll never know what we get kind of with how things are being skewed in favor of favorites.
Yeah, so let me get a bit to measurement and mechanisms. I think we are circling around this argument that corruption doesn't necessarily, or undue influence doesn't necessarily happen in the procurement tendering phase. And I think if you look at the indicators like sole sourcing, it doesn't imply that the actual specifications are tricked or biased, right? It can be that exactly what happened is that the donation led to a particular policy design, a particular product design, so that there will be only one company bidding, or there would be true justification for sole sourcing procedure because it's really a unique product, right? So the measurement is it's measuring the outcome of these, right? It can be that the influence happened before the tendering phase or during the tendering phase. Now, debarment, cost overruns, and tax havens. So I want to highlight that even though I have these two, supplier tax haven registration and supplier debarred, these are cool indicators, but I call them, in a way, these are fire alarms. They're very rare, and they're very strong. If a federal contractor is registered in Cayman Islands, how bad can it be, right? So these quantitatively, these two influence the overall indicator very little, right? So you have 1% of contracts going to tax haven registrations, 1% of companies, or 2% of companies being debarred, right? The big piece of action happens single bidding, no publication, and these things. Right? Another thing with cost overrun, that's another kind of tricky indicator because most contracts go on, on budget or just under, right? And then there is this long tail.
But I think Scott and I would tell you there's an inverse relationship to size, complexity, and importance. So macro level number of contracts. But in terms of dollars,
exactly.
Empirically, the bigger contracts, there's always going to be.
Exactly. So that's the story. So numbers wise, the standard small to medium sized contracts is almost always on target, right? And then these few big ones, the joint fights, right? So that's an extreme case, right? And huge, and it's few cases with enormous large percentage and also large dollar over overruns. So I think that's again a kind of a tricky indicator. It's in there because it's very powerful, but it signals very extreme cases, but then it's a very strong signal.
And it's also tricky due to the fact that you don't know what drove the cost overrun. Was it a change by the government, or was it problems by the contractor? We like to blame the contractor for every cost overrun, but I would imagine that it's probably equally weighted that the government's just as fault that they've changed the requirements, they've changed certain standards, they found certain things out. And so at that point, it's being driven by the government agency itself. And sometimes they even rescale these. And so a cost overrun may have been a cost overrun one day, but then they'll just rescale it and change the financing, whatever it is on it. And so at that point, they'll say, well, it's not over. And, they'll adjust the numbers. And so you have to always worry about that. It's hard to tell where it started and where it ended. And,
So quickly response to that. So the reason why we run these many fixed defects is that if an agency tends to be more prone to cost overruns, I have in the model a control for that. So each agency is compared to itself, right? So if compared to your historic average, you do more overruns with this particular company compared to that company's historic average. This is where I get the effect, right? Everyone is compared to his or her historic average, right? So that's why I think it's more or less controlling for these problems. So for DUNS, so how it's in the database, there are two DUNS numbers for each contract. One is the contracting entity who is actually delivering or signing the contract, and is the ultimate owner. They have to register. I don't know how reliable that is. But what we did, okay, it's not, thank you. So what we did is that we aggregated all these donations by the ultimate owner. So all the Lockheed Martin subsidiaries are counted as one Lockheed Martin. So if we go with the data there is, and I know that the DUNS numbers themselves have problems, and I'm sure the recording of these numbers have the problems. But that's probably noise in the data, but that's how we do it. Subcontractors is a thing, I've never seen a country with good subcontracting data. Never. And I think there's a reason to that, right? And this is a big black hole, right? I mean, often corruption happens it's the black hole, right? So I would love to have more subcontractors data. So closed industries, I mean, we run everything without defense. So basically cutting the data set into half. And we find similar results, which tells me that probably these things happen in defense and outside of defense, but I think we all know defense is a universe on its own, so it would be worth a separate study. Yeah.
Please.
So I have a question about single bidding.
Yeah.
Two questions related, perhaps. One is, do you take out the small contracts, that is, the small dollar contracts?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that is maybe a completely different rationale.
Yeah.
Second, do you distinguish between contracts to individuals and contracts to organizations? Because that may build in the same kind of question or bias in your data.
Okay, so the analysis is conducted only on contracts above $180,000. And the reason for that is that, I know it's unimportant, but the reason for that is the WTO threshold for the international competition. So that's, and then basically I haven't found individuals getting that high value contract.
Well,
it's maybe
some
so
of them are because if some of these individuals, I represented a bunch of individuals challenging the constitutionality of the federal statute as applied to individuals. And if somebody used to work for an agency and they come back as an employee, low-level employees, the contract, if they get for 3-year contract, they're getting paid $100,000 a year. 3-year contract, it shows up on the contract as $300,000. And so it might not kick in. And there are, as you probably know, a very large number of those former employees, who are brought back to keep the number of current employees down, so they don't look like they have a big agency, and it skews all of the.
Yeah, but they don't have DUNS numbers. We dropped everything which doesn't have DUNS number. Okay, so the individuals basically dropped. Yeah.
The Defense Department uses a code called the CAGE code, which is better than DUNS. They're very rigorous about it. It's used also to track classified information. So look at the CAGE code, because it tends to be much more reliable than the DUNS number as you're tracking these. And the Defense Department then keeps track, the government keeps track of the affiliates up through the chain by CAGE code.
CAGE, C-A-G-E.
Like caging a dog.
Yeah. Good one. Okay.
Maybe one more question? Anybody? Well, I just want to say on behalf of Transparency International, how really grateful I am to Professor Yukins and George Washington University, Carey and Cassandra, for really hosting this conversation, as well as obviously to these terrific panelists. We're really starting to see, part of my work is really trying to bring together the sort of brain trust that I've been blessed to get to know in the global space around public contracting with the US space, and this is just sort of a beginning point in time of that, and it's just been really clear from the panel about, you know, the sort of demonstrated and profound value of this kind of research for policy and advocacy, whether it's the need to advocate for higher integrity in government and administration, looking at debarment, but also we've gotten such terrific pointers from you all, from the audience, around the kind of data and from the panelists that we need to get deeper than the tip of the iceberg. But this, as a start, is such a profoundly exciting start. So I hope we all agree that we should be having this conversation more regularly, this kind of conversation. And I look forward, we have Transparency International to contribute to that any way that we can. But I'm really grateful to you all who are the experts for the conversation that we've had today. So many thanks for that.
Thank you.